Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mitigation Strategies for Urban Farms. As a reminder, all of these recorded sessions are on Canvas and Google Drive. And so just to get into the intro of climate change mitigation, we'll be discussing the definition of what is mitigation, and it's really tackling the causes of climate change rather than the consequences, which in the previous session, we talked about adaptation. So this involves reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases or enhancing our carbon sinks. And there's a lot of synergies between the two in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. A few examples are infrastructure, green infrastructure, power system resilience, protecting sustainable transportation, water and energy conservation, building weatherization. These are all areas and actions that target both mitigation and adaptation. And on a state level, there's legislation called the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act. And the goal is to have 70% of renewable energy by 2030 and 100% of zero emission electricity by 2040, and an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. So pretty ambitious state level policy there on climate. And in terms of where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, these are the general main industries. So we have transportation, electricity production, industrial processes, agriculture and land use, commercial and residential. And in terms of domestic greenhouse gas emissions in the US by sector, transportation is the bulk of that, followed by electrical power, industry, commercial and residential, and lastly, agriculture. On a state level, buildings are really the main sources of greenhouse gases in New York State, followed by transportation, electricity, waste, industry, and lastly, agriculture at 6%. For those that aren't familiar, En-ROADS is a climate simulator that lets you adjust different levers, including energy supply, transport, buildings, growth, carbon dioxide removal. And the goal of all of changing these levers is to see if we can reach 1.3 or even less degree change by 2100. So this is a great simulator that was created by MIT. So if you have a chance to check it out, I highly recommend looking it up. Another resource for more climate mitigation information is Project Drawdown. And so they are working on this framework for looking at greenhouse gas mitigation, focusing on electricity, food, agriculture, and land use, industry, transport, buildings. So reducing sinks, reducing sources, supporting sinks, and lastly, improving sustainability of society as a whole. And all of this is really different pieces of the mitigation puzzle. If we think about renewables, efficiency, but also looking at carbon sequestration, healthy soil, carbon capture, reducing food waste, composting, negative emissions, climate smart ag practices. These are all important pieces of that puzzle. Increasing energy efficiency of buildings. So daylighting, getting rid of energy vampires, unplugging a lot of your devices during the day, increasing efficiency of appliances. So looking at ones that are rated higher efficiency, energy conservation in buildings, whether that be in the form of insulation, lighting, windows, and also installation of smart meters. And the co-benefits of electrification result in a lot of times saving money on fossil fuels, higher efficiency, better for the environment, lower emissions, better air quality. An example of that could be installing solar to power fully electric vehicles. And cleaner electricity could be in the form of residential solar, power purchase agreements or PPAs, wind, geothermal, ground source heat pumps, hydropower, community solar programs, microgrids, and community choice aggregation. And in terms of updating infrastructure to have more green buildings, that looks like lighting upgrades to more LEDs, HVAC, watering, heating upgrades, creating a building envelope or insulation, and just having more renewable energy that's powering the electricity of buildings. And some local resources here in New York City. For those that aren't familiar, New York City Accelerators is sort of a one-stop shop for all of the information and technical assistance around getting estimates for a solar panel or a heat pump. So in my building, we're actually doing this in a co-op. So I was able to reach out to New York City Accelerator and get an estimate, and through CPC funding or Community Preservation Corporation climate capital funding, was able to get a grant to help with installing solar panels on my building's rooftop. So all of these are examples from the Inflation Reduction Act and just a dedication to climate funding to help reduce fossil fuels in New York City. And I'll pass it over to my colleague Savannah, who's going to be talking about mitigation in agriculture and land use.
Hey everybody.
I have to resume.
Okay. Hey everybody. So right now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different factors in agriculture that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're talking about that in ag, we're usually talking about emissions from livestock, fertilizers, or machinery and equipment. So agriculture's emissions come from three main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And these different greenhouse gases have different levels of permanence and different levels of impacts on the greenhouse gas effect. You can look at this graphic here to kind of learn a little bit more about which gases come from which types of agriculture. So for example, rice cultivation and paddies produces a lot of methane, while manure from cattle also produces a lot of methane, but then they also burp out a lot of nitrous oxide. So you can learn a bit more about that there. And you can also see how we're taking in or sequestering some of these greenhouse gases on the other side, where we're converting land over to forest, for example, and creating long-term carbon storages, or applying biochar, which is also a more permanent long-term carbon storage. So this is just another way to look at how much greenhouse gases are being emitted across the board here. So you can see that agriculture compared to other industries is a relatively low emitter, but is still an emitter of greenhouse gases. But agriculture is unique when compared to other industries because we're the only industry that has the opportunity to be a drawdown source so far. So we do that through implementing practices like cover cropping, applying biochar, rock dust, etc., to try to lock some of that carbon into the soil. So the key here is really understanding where we're starting from. So if we aren't able to measure our greenhouse gas emissions, we're unable to understand how to mitigate or reduce them. So this is a great quote here. It says that measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. And if you can't control it, you can't improve it. So there are a few tools available to farms in New York State that help kind of assess your baseline of where you are in terms of emissions. So a great program that's out there right now is this NYSERDA Farm Energy Audit Program. If you follow the link at this QR code here, you can learn a bit more about the program. But basically, it is a state-run program where they have auditors come onto your farm. They look at all the different things you're doing on your farm that might consume energy and decide how much, and give you a quote on how much of that energy is coming from what source and how you might be able to gain a bit more efficiency in your system. So for example, if you are a dairy farm or if you're a greenhouse producer in the city, they can come out, they can look at your lighting, for example, and maybe make some recommendations on how to upgrade your lighting so that you're consuming less electricity in terms of your lighting. So to find out more, please just follow this link here and sign up. So a little bit more about energy audits. If you don't want to go through NYSERDA or if you don't pay the appropriate charge to be eligible for those audits, you can also do it on your own or hire out a different contractor to help you with that because it can be a little technical. But having these audits on hand are great to help you out if you're thinking about applying for some type of grant to do some upgrades. For example, this is great documentation of where you currently stand on your farm in terms of the amount of energy that you're consuming, and then also identifying what practices you want to implement or what fixtures you might want to change to help reduce your electrical demand. And those are always great things to include in any type of grant application that you might want to put in that's kind of focused on making these types of improvements. So in addition to doing an energy audit, understanding where you are, some other steps that you can take to reduce on-farm emissions are just generally trying to conserve more energy and improve your efficiency. So making sure that you're understanding what your utility costs are so that you know when there's an unexpected spike. You can go out and look around and see if maybe something's on or running that normally wouldn't be or shouldn't be, and that's wasting money on top of increasing your emissions. And then in addition to that, going out seeking some of these grants that help you pay for efficiency upgrades or just paying for those out of pocket, because oftentimes they will save you money in the long run. And then learning a bit about some efficiency strategies that you might be able to implement on your farm. That looks different across the board depending on what type of farm you are, but NYSERDA has some great fact sheets and data out there on how you can try to do that on your farm. Highly recommend checking out those resources. In addition to that, you can think about installing or applying for different types of renewable energy on your farm. Most common would be installing solar panels or maybe looking at small scale wind or tapping into some type of bioenergy. So, key here, just really tap into and understand your utility costs. So know when your peak usage is happening, what kind of demand you have, how much your energy is costing per unit, and then just kind of figure out what the baseline is so that you can identify when things are different or changing. And you can work with your utility to try to understand or shift to different types of electricity if they have more solar online, for example, figuring out how you can tap into that resource versus using more traditional coal or gas-powered electricity. And electricity is a free market, so you have that opportunity to select a different supplier in some cases, in some areas, if they're offering a better product that will save you money and is better for the environment. So when we're talking about programs that can help you pay for efficiency updates, here's some steps that you can take. So really key thing to do, first off, is to develop a long-term plan and consider which stages you want to implement the different upgrades in your energy audit. If you're able to get that, that'll actually lay that out for you without you having to put in a ton of effort outside of what the auditor provides for you. And then you take that information, you can turn that into grant applications for programs like EQIP through NRCS or REAP. And in addition to those two federal programs, we also have state-by-state incentive programs. So NYSERDA will sometimes have some energy efficiency programs that pop up. Or for example, Ulster County had a program last year that paid for energy efficiency upgrades on different farms within the county, and having that audit on hand was really handy for some of those farms that were applying for that program. Additionally, there are different rebate and incentive programs administered by local utilities that you can identify based on who your provider is. And if you want to learn more about different incentives for renewable energy and efficiency, you can follow this link here in the bottom right-hand corner. So building energy conservation. Conservation is always the best first step. It's always the easiest thing to do. Just use less. Another thing that's fairly simple to do, but that can have huge savings is improving your insulation in buildings that you heat or refrigerate. Use high efficiency lighting, motors, and fans. So when it comes time to maybe replace some of those light bulbs, spring a little bit more for the more higher efficiency bulbs that will save you money in the long run. Um, and then having timers on some things like lights, for example, that are easy to forget on. Having occupancy sensors in barns or buildings where you might forget that you turn the lights on overnight. I know I've done that before. And, lighting really is a simple way to lower energy use and save money, and it's relatively inexpensive when compared to a lot of these other interventions that you can go after. So so when we're talking about greenhouses, those can really be some serious energy sinks. But NYSERDA does have a special program. Their energy audit program does have a special program just for greenhouses, and they can help make all sorts of recommendations for your specific instance. So I can't stress enough how great it would be to do that if you have a greenhouse that you are heating. So some other things that you can do just on your own are take note of and reduce air leakage. If you have a greenhouse that is covered in glass paneling, investing in double layer glazing can help to insulate your greenhouse a bit more. Install energy curtains to help reduce the amount of heating. Install foundations and sidewalls to help reduce leakage of air from underneath the sidewalls. Look at efficient energy systems. Plan your crop cycles so that you're planting crops that appreciate cooler climates in cooler seasons. So, for example, plant your spinach in the winter and plant your heat levers like tomatoes in the summer when it's hotter, so that you don't have to invest in as much cooling. And then, yeah, think about upgrading your lighting when you can. So we're talking about tractors and tractor lighting, tractor operation efficiency. So just making sure that you're on top of maintenance can help improve the efficiency of some of these machines. Reducing your tillage really saves not only fuel, but also time. So implementing practices that enable you to do that, like cover cropping, strip till, etc. Match your implement to the appropriate size of your tractor, and then optimize the number of trips that you want to take. So, for example, if you're thinking about spraying something from your tractor onto the field, thinking about what things you can mix into a tank, for example, so you don't have to spray multiple times. And then use the Nebraska Tractor Test Lab data when choosing a new tractor. That can help give you some information on more energy efficient models. Oops.
And a few examples of that renewable energy looks like wind, solar, or bioenergy. So the photo here on the left are sunflowers for biofuel. This middle folder is an example of an urban wind turbine. So having just a different design than what you're normally used to. And lastly, agrivoltaics, which is solar panels on farms, which in some cases can be incorporated with livestock or used as shading for certain greens, as in this scenario here in the photo. A few examples of renewable energy on urban farms. This photo here on the left, this is actually D-Town Farms in Detroit, and this is a windmill, and they were able to get a federal funding for that and a solar panel to help with the control panel for that. So that is an example of having renewable energy on a farm because they didn't have access to power since this is in a city-owned park. Other examples of renewable energy here in New York City. This is a photo here on the left of Red Hook Farms, and the solar panels, it helps to power some of the electricity that is needed on the farm. It's right next to their compost project, and they're able to use some of that electricity for their farm operations. This photo here on the right is an example of basically a solar car park. So the solar panels are acting as shade for the cars underneath. And Brooklyn, this is the Brooklyn Whole Foods in Gowanus, in Gowanus. And I'll just turn it back to Savannah, who's going to be talking about the Cool Farm tool.
Great. So getting back to the question of measurement and understanding what exactly you're emitting so you can help mitigate it on the back end. Some tools that can help out with that are the Cool Farm tool, which you can find at the link up here in the upper right-hand corner. It kind of helps you understand based off of your production system, what you're emitting and what are some steps you can take to reduce your emissions. So this is just a few screen captures from the tool. It's really geared more so towards dairy or corn, soy, larger scale crop growers versus urban growers, but it's a great resource to go and look around if you just want to learn a little bit more generally about greenhouse gas emissions in farming. Would recommend plunking around it. So now we're going to shift over to talking a little bit about soil, which is one of our best tools when we're talking about storing carbon. So soil, you can see here, is a huge carbon sink when compared to the atmosphere and animals and plants. So that's 2,400 billions of tons of carbon that is stored in the soil. And we're going to talk a little bit about how farmers can maximize soil carbon storage. So they can either do that by increasing the carbon going into the soil, and we'll talk about some practices that do that. And they can also do that by preventing carbon from leaving the soil and going to the atmosphere by reducing tillage, etc. One way to get a good baseline of what your soil carbon is to submit a sample to the Cornell Soil Health Laboratory. The test that they do is called the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. You get a soil report card that you can see over here on the right-hand side that kind of looks at the physical, biological, and chemical aspects of your soil and gives you a grade on the health of your soil based off of those three components off of different tests that measure those three components. So it gives you a good idea of how much carbon you're storing as a baseline if you're going to make some type of change into the future. So this would be great to take a test. For example, if you're going to begin cover cropping, you could take one of these pre-cover cropping, and then, you know, the next year or maybe even 3 years after that, because some of these changes can be a little slow to come on, you can take another test to see what the numerical change was. So carbon sequestration. We're going to discuss a little bit about what some methods for potentially sequestering carbon in soils are. Some of those are reducing our tillage. So that means that either we eliminate tillage or we reduce the number of passes that we do in a year, or we do less dramatic deep tillage. Additionally, we can add cover crops that help to add carbon back into the soil. For example, we have a daikon or tillage radish up here in the upper right-hand corner. Those guys are really great at quickly pulling carbon from the atmosphere, storing it in their plant tissues, and then returning that to the soil as those plants break down. Additionally, you can make independent organic matter additions. So that's like adding compost into the soil to up your total ON, which also in turn ups your carbon storage. And you can think about replacing annual crops with perennial crops. So, for example, you can think about implementing agroforestry in some way, planting nut trees that reduce the amount of tillage that you need to do to get a crop every year, and also are storing more carbon in woody tissue. And then that goes right along with adding, protecting, and growing trees. So really reducing annual crops and adding trees kind of go hand in hand there. So one other thing we need to talk about is permanence, additionality, and leakage. So permanence is a question of, is the soil that we're adding to the soil staying there for long amounts of time? Or is it simply, we apply compost, the carbon is there for a year or two, but then it goes back into the atmosphere because we tilt. Additionality, that's a question of, would this carbon have ended up in the soil in a business as usual scenario? So that's a question of, are we actually adding something extra to the soil here, or is this something that would have been there anyway? Leakage is using a practice intended to sequester carbon here, but it causes emissions somewhere else. Yeah, so you can think about that in terms of, well, maybe you ordered a new special cover crop seed to plant onto your field to sequester some carbon, but maybe you ordered that seed and it came from somewhere halfway around the world, like Australia. So you're actually adding emissions and from the transport of the seed. And you have to think about, okay, am I actually creating more emissions by importing these seeds than I would add into the soil? And saturation is very key here. So there is a limit to the amount of carbon that any soil can accumulate naturally. So we need to recognize and understand when we have hit that point and realize that soils just can't endlessly take up carbon. So some potential opportunities for carbon sequestration. We're going to talk a little bit about carbon markets. Carbon markets can provide farmers with opportunities to earn income by generating and selling carbon credits through practices that reduce emissions or sequester carbon on their land. This really depends on there being a good price of carbon out there and that farmers have buy-in and support in accessing these markets. For example, some of the more popular carbon crediting programs now, um, one thing that the supplier of the carbon credits really has to think about is the ability to verify that the carbon was actually removed from the atmosphere and stored without any of these four problems that we talked about before, specifically leakage or saturation, etc., taking place. So in terms of ag carbon credits right now, a lot of people are saying that biochar is the most secure ag carbon credit because it's very easy comparatively to measure exactly how much carbon you're adding into the soil, and biochar is a relatively permanent form of carbon sequestration in the soil. So a lot of folks are getting really excited and talking about potential for carbon sequestration, carbon markets, specifically looking at biochar. And these are programs that farmers can participate in voluntarily, or they could participate in it to comply to some sort of regulation that is proposed, so that's not happening in the United States. So carbon markets are a little bit complicated. So this quote here says that we can still identify cases where one model will predict soil carbon loss and another will predict, for the purported same conditions, soil carbon sequestration. So I wouldn't yet characterize it as settled. So like I mentioned, there's a lot going on in the science here determining how exactly we should be measuring soil carbon and how we should be issuing credits for carbon sequestration. That's why a lot of people are turning to some of these more simple credits, like within the biochar community. So reducing tillage is a key tool in our belt here. Reducing tillage, particularly no-till, can increase soil carbon. This mainly comes from the fact that we're not exposing the carbon in the soil to the atmosphere, to oxygen, in a way that it can be consumed by aerobic microbes in the soil and then gassed off into the atmosphere in the form of CO2 or other greenhouse gases. So there is debate about how much carbon can be sequestered by reducing tillage. Like I mentioned, this is where the saturation question comes into play here. There is a ceiling on how much carbon you can have in any one soil. Reducing tillage is beneficial to soil health and it creates improved crop growing conditions. So oftentimes when you reduce tillage, you're reducing disturbance of microbial communities, and that in turn allows some of these microbes to thrive and prosper, and they're creating all these types of enzymes and different molecules that are acting as glue to our soil and creating really good soil structure for us to capitalize on as farmers. Benefits from reducing tillage take time to build up, and they can be quickly reduced or eliminated by just one tillage pass. So you have to have a lot of patience and time invested in this practice. And the depth at which the carbon is sequestered matters. So just keep all these things in mind when you're considering reducing your tillage. Another great practice that you can implement is cover cropping. Benefits of cover cropping include increased water quality, increased water infiltration, reduced erosion, and adding cover crops can also be an effective way to increase soil carbon. So really, when you're thinking about a lot of these practices, you don't need to only solely think of them as ways to increase soil carbon or mitigate your greenhouse gas emissions. You should also be thinking about the side benefits that you're getting from them. For example, if you're somebody that's really struggling with water infiltration or ponding, or you have poor soil structure in your field, you can think about adding cover cropping into your rotation to help with those issues and while also getting this side benefit of increasing the amount of carbon in your soils. So a lot of these practices have multifaceted benefits, key to keep in mind. And cover cropping is one of the least expensive methods for increasing soil carbon. There are a lot of programs in New York State that help support cover cropping. For example, lots of different soil and water conservation districts have programs that provide seed or payments for seed or per acreage for cover cropping. That's not very useful to urban farms, but I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to them to see what type of support they could potentially provide to you there. Um, so you can see in this graph over on the right, this is a little graph talking about how soil organic carbon stocks change when you implement cover cropping over time. Next, we're going to talk about biochar. So the USDA definition of biochar is a solid carbon-rich material made from organic waste that's been partially burned. Biochar is created through pyrolysis. So that means that you're heating up the organic material to a very high level, but you have an absence of oxygen, which helps prevent the carbon in the organic material from turning into CO2 and escaping into the atmosphere, and stores it as stable carbon that's solid that you can actually touch and feel. Biochar can be made from anything that contains carbon, so that means woody waste or even non-woody waste from our gardens, branches that you might find that have fallen down, compost things that you might want to put in your compost, like orange peels, etc. Really anything that is carbon based can be charred. So benefits of biochar and applying biochar is that it is a persistent form of carbon storage in soils. Right now, our best guess is that biochar can persist as permanent carbon sequestration in the soil for 2,500 or more years. Biochar is a very porous material, and that creates a great home for microbes to live in. And a side benefit of that porous structure is that it increases soil water holding capacity, and it acts as a magnet, kind of sucking up some of that excess nutrient that's maybe around in your soil. For example, if you're somebody that's applying a lot of compost, maybe you have a lot of excess phosphorus or something in your soils. Adding biochar can help scavenge some of that excess phosphorus so that it's not running off into the watershed that you're living within. And then another thing that biochar can do is it can increase plant yields in poor soils with low carbon content. So really we're thinking about soils that are very sandy, that have low cation exchange capacity. This kind of adds a way to buffer some of those nutrients in those soils. So within Web Soil Survey, if that's something you're familiar with, there's a great tool that is a biochar evaluation tool that allows you to look at your specific soil and see how beneficial a biochar addition would be on your soil. recommend checking that out. So biochar is not a new idea. It's a process that began thousands of years ago in the Amazon basin. So folks there were burning swaths of forest, and then that was creating this really carbon-rich material that was then returned to the earth, creating these unique terra preta soils that you can see over here on the right. The picture on the left is a soil that is not terra preta, so that's just the native soil without this addition of biochar. And then on the far right, you see what it looks like when native folks here burn material and then left that for on the soil. So you can visually see how much darker it is. And that visual difference also translates to a difference in carbon content between the two soils, which is ultimately translating into a difference in productivity even all these years later. So, really not a new idea, but something that we can fashion nowadays to help us mitigate some of our emissions. So this is a great video you can watch, kind of explaining what pyrolysis is. Another practice that you can implement to help reduce or help sequester carbon in the soil is applying rock dust, or it's also referred to as enhanced rock weathering. So that means that we're applying rocks that have been crushed up to the field, and when the rock in the field reacts with rainwater, it forms carbonates, which permanently capture the carbon into a solid form that persists in the soil. There are some side benefits from these types of applications in that they may replace some of your lime application in some instances. So that means that it raises your soil pH and reduces the need to go out and purchase some of these amendments. Silicates like wollastonite can offer some side benefits in some crops, like pumpkins, for example, by enhancing resistance to powdery mildew. But there are some drawbacks in play here. So there's potential for some heavy metal contamination based off of what your parent rock is. And you need to be aware of the need for using PPE when handling some of these dusts, specifically wollastonite, which is a silicate that has very sharp edges and can kind of act like asbestos in some manner. So if you're going to implement rock dust, you need to really read up on it, understand the parent rock that you're applying. Usually folks recommend basalt because it's pretty safe to handle and it has less of these heavy metals in it. But if you want to get the side benefit to by raising the silica in your soil by applying something like wollastonite, be aware of the fact that you're going to need to wear a respirator when you're applying that. So just making sure that you're fully understanding and educated before jumping into that can be important. Key thing to note here, though, is that some folks are making use of the fact that rock dust can introduce more heavy metals into the soil. This company called Metal Plant, they're applying, I believe, olivine to the soil, and then they're using plants that have an affinity for taking up nickel to phytomine nickel from the soil. That's then used in batteries and the likes. So interesting use of rock dust there. Another thing that you can look at is replacing annual crops with perennial crops. So this has strong potential to increase soil carbon, especially in urban environments. I would say planting perennial crops means increased vegetation cover, more biomass, more plant residues, etc., less or no tillage, and less use of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And perennial crops could be fruit trees, short rotation woody crops, for example. You could plant willow and then make baskets from that, or make paper from it, or use it to make bioenergy, for example. Or you could plant perennial grasses and legumes. So over here on the right side at the top, you see an example of alley cropping in which there's a hay crop that's being produced between, I believe these are poplars that are going to be harvested in a few years to make lumber or paper. And then at the bottom, you see an example of two perennial crops coexisting side by side. You have figs on the left, and you have asparagus on the right. And the fig is kind of acting as shade or a nurse to the asparagus on the right-hand side. Uh, for example, if it was really hot or something, you might see a benefit to the health of the asparagus from the shade provided by the fig. In addition to reducing the amount of tillage you need to do, since these are both woody crops, they're going to be planted there for, until you dig them up, basically. So, key thing that we're taking advantage of here is that trees remove CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and then convert that into their woody tissues that store carbon. And you can see this is a great mock-up that kind of talks about how this whole process plays into carbon sequestration. So forests can be carbon sinks or sources. When when forests are growing quickly or they're in peak growth stage, they're taking up more carbon than they are when they are have hit their plateau of growth, or if there's a fire, for example. Another time when they are emitting carbon is when after they've hit their maximum lifespan, they've fallen over and they're decomposing. And that's really naturally releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So by managing our forest, we kind of help get around some of these issues. For example, if you're managing a forest and you notice that some of your trees are dead or dying, you could harvest those trees and then convert those into biochar, which is a more permanent form of carbon storage, and apply that back to the forest for as a long-term management strategy. So adding trees is really the easiest, quickest way to kind of help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. It can be pretty hands-off if you have the space to dedicate to it. So trees are great accumulators of carbon. And you should, if you have land that is available to forests, just going ahead and biting the bullet and planting trees now. You'll see benefits from those in later years. For example, if you're interested in producing nuts, you can plant chestnuts, for example, or even just thinking about implementing fruit trees into your system. If you have a small section of your farm or garden that you think might benefit or be a good home for an apple tree even, that's a great way to kind of draw down some carbon, but also reduce your tillage since you're planting this more permanent crop there. So how does agroforestry reduce greenhouse gas emissions? When I'm talking about agroforestry, we're talking about a myriad of different practices that are lumped into this one category. So like I mentioned before, we have alley cropping, we also have forest farming, we have trees that are planted as windbreaks or shelter belts, and then we have hedgerows. So you can learn a little bit more about all these different practices just by reading here, but um, some of these practices that might be most beneficial to urban growers are forest farming for urban growers that might be growing in a park area or something that already has established trees. You could think about maybe adding some mushroom totems with shiitakes or something like that to produce a product within the existing forest. If you're somebody that's struggling with a lot of sheer winds coming from one direction on your farm, you can think about planting a fast-growing tree like willow to kind of reduce some of that wind coming onto your farm, while also providing some of these other side benefits of agroforestry. And then planting hedgerows could also provide a similar sort of benefit with side benefit of providing habitat for wildlife like birds and beneficial insects, etc. Usually, when we're talking about hedgerows, we can talk about plants like willows, shrub willow in particular, but we can also talk about more shrubby, dense plants that might have less of an agrarian benefit, but have a better benefit for habitat. So all these different practices that we talked about today all have different potential for mitigating or storing carbon in the soil, etc. And you can read a bit more about that at this link provided here from the NRCS. And I encourage you to kind of delve into this graphic if you want to learn a bit more. But really, the practices that have the most potential have the most permanence, least leakage, etc. Like, I really am a believer in applying biochar, for example, if we're talking about long-term carbon removals. And I'm a believer in cover cropping, reduced tillage, etc. But do acknowledge that those have less carbon storage potential than some of these other practices. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement them anyway, because they have this myriad of side benefits in addition to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. You can also look at some tools like Comet Planner if you want to learn a bit more about what emissions are like on your farm. Like I mentioned before with the Cool Farm tool, these tools are really geared more so towards large scale growers, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take the opportunity to look around them to get some ideas for your farms. So takeaways and conclusions. We should all keep in mind that this is a learning process and there's a lot of important and interesting research continuously happening in this space. We're also learning about how to best mitigate climate change in agriculture, and we're still learning how to quantify changes in carbon sequestration. And key thing here, we're still learning about how to best model soil carbon sequestration. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't act now. So despite some uncertainty, most of the practices and strategies we have discussed have important benefits beyond reducing emissions or sequestering carbon. Like I mentioned before, that can look like increasing water holding capacity, for example, or creating a better home for microbes that help increase plant yields. Often implementing efficient strategies offers an opportunity for saving money. For example, if you go out and get an energy audit and you find that you're going to save $1,000 a year by simply changing your light bulbs, that's a great and easy way to not only save money, but reduce emissions. And we're still thinking that payments will become available to farmers who use practices to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So that might come from private companies who are offering carbon credits, or it might continue to come through state programs like climate resilient farming, etc., who are paying you to implement practices on your farms. So we need to think about all sorts of different gases when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, not just CO2, or making our management decisions. But at the end of the day, we should keep in mind that we really have a unique opportunity in agriculture when compared to other industries, especially because we do have this inbuilt natural ability to draw down carbon from the atmosphere through the fact that we're producing oftentimes plants who are really good at doing that. So at the end of the day, take all this with a grain of salt, but do what works best for your farm, and take a look at some of these practices and let us know if you have any questions.